podcast designed to take the listener deeper into Scripture and biblical thought. I'm Ed Gallagher, professor of Christian Scripture at Heritage Christian University. I hope to cover a variety of topics with you about Scripture. This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Heritage Christian University, where we help students to thrive in ministry. To find out more, go to hcu.edu. We're also partnering with the Ministry League Network. They have free resources to help the local church all over the world. Download the app in the iOS or Play Store, or check out the website at ministryleague.com. And now, welcome to the podcast.
I think it's just today and next week, and then this series will be over. We're still talking about Satan. We'll talk about Satan today. We'll talk about Satan next week. So that means I don't have time to get to stuff like demons and whatever is going on at the beginning of Genesis 6, for instance, and other things that we could talk about. We're going back to the Old Testament now, though. We've talked about Satan. We've talked about the Hebrew word Satan. I don't think that ever refers to Satan as we think of him. We have talked about the New Testament. There, I think we do find Satan that we are more or less familiar with. So it's a New Testament concept, a New Testament character, not visible really very much in Jewish literature around the time of the New Testament, and not visible, I would argue, and I have argued before you, even in the Old Testament. But there are some passages that we still need to talk about. Maybe they do give us insight into Satan, though they don't use the word. Let's see. So I have argued that we never find in the Old Testament, under the name Satan, the chief agent of evil who is an enemy of God. But since the chief agent of evil, who is an enemy of God, does appear in the New Testament under the name Satanas or Diabolos, it has long been tempting to try to find his influence in the Old Testament as well. Christians have been pretty successful at this exercise of finding Satan in the Old Testament. And by successful, I just mean whether or not we agree with them, I don't. They have managed to do it. They have identified passages where they think, well, here, look here. This is Satan. Justin Martyr identified Satan, Justin Martyr from the 2nd century A.D., identified Satan in several Old Testament passages. So we've got the snake in Genesis 3, of course. Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the sons of God got together with the daughters of men, that passage. Exodus 7 and 8, the Egyptian magicians. Justin Martyr said, look here, there's Satan is in this passage. 1 Kings 18, that's the prophets of Baal. Numbers chapter 21, this is strange, I don't remember how he does this, but Numbers chapter 21, verses 8 and 9, the bronze serpent. So Justin Martyr thinks Satan has something to do with it. Maybe he's killing the people or something. Leviathan in Isaiah 27. And then the lion in Psalm 22, verse 13. So if you look in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, and of course that's one of the things you should look in at some point, and you look for all the times that Justin Martyr finds Satan in the Old Testament, I think that's the list. I think Christians today could probably also find the influence of the devil in each of these passages, though the devil is mentioned in none of them. So, for instance, the Egyptian magicians in Exodus 7 to 8. Do you think Satan is involved somehow? Maybe, Is he mentioned? No, not mentioned. Is he in the background? Is he maybe empowering those magicians? I'm open to the argument. Not mentioned, though. Is Satan the Leviathan of Isaiah 27? Maybe. I'm open to the argument. Not mentioned, certainly. I mean, for that matter, Is Satan, can we see the influence of Satan in 2 Samuel chapter 11? When a certain lady goes and takes a bath on the roof of her house, and a certain king goes, because he can't sleep, so he goes out on the roof at that time. You know, I'm talking about David and Bathsheba. Do we see the influence of Satan there? Sure, yeah, I could see that. Is he mentioned? No, certainly not. Not in the text of Scripture, even though his influence might be visible. I'm open to the argument that maybe we get some of that in the Old Testament, but not mentioned. So Justin does not discover in any of these passages an explanation for the origins of the devil, except perhaps for Genesis 3 and Genesis 6. Christians today would often agree that Genesis 3 is relevant, and they would often raise an eyebrow regarding the relevance of Genesis 6. That's the sons of God and the daughters of men. We're not going to talk about either of those today. There are two other Old Testament passages that have been used to explain the origins of the devil, but neither of them are cited by Justin. About a century after Justin, Origen provided a similar list of Old Testament passages in which the devil features. And he not only included Genesis 3, but also the other two prominent passages for explaining Satan's origins, and those are Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14. Now, again, I've said it a number of times already. I'll say it again. In none of these Old Testament passages is the devil actually mentioned, but his influence can perhaps be seen in them. And so we're going to turn our attention to Ezekiel 28 first. And we'll, I think, have time for Isaiah 14, and I'm going to put off Genesis 3 until next week. The book of Ezekiel contains a 9-verse section, that's Ezekiel 28, verses 11 to 19, that has often been interpreted as describing the origins of Satan. Ezekiel does not say that he is describing Satan at all. He says that he's talking about the king of Tyre, or the prince of Tyre. This is the final oracle against Tyre and its king in the book. There have been 3 chapters of the book of Ezekiel are dedicated to Tyre, Ezekiel 26 to 28. And Ezekiel 28 begins with a oracle against the king of Tyre, and now here's the second oracle, starting in verse 11, against the king of Tyre. All right, but it's only this second oracle, well, it's usually only this second oracle against the king of Tyre that is considered maybe talking about Satan. It is not hard to understand why some people have thought Ezekiel was describing Satan, even if he doesn't say so. He describes the king of Tyre as full of wisdom and perfect in beauty, verse 12. And then he says something that everyone agrees could not possibly apply to the king of Tyre in any sort of literal way. In verse 13, you were in Eden, the garden of God. And then there's this is verse 14, and I'm quoting to you from the ESV. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. So we've got the king of Tyre being described as a very beautiful guardian cherub in the Garden of Eden. Ezekiel continues by describing the fall of the king of Tyre. You were blameless in your ways until iniquity was found in you. That's verse 15. The guardian cherub grew full of pride, so God expelled him from the garden. That's what we see in verses 16 and 17. Again, Ezekiel cannot be describing the king of Tyre in a literal way. And the passage sounds a lot like what we otherwise know about the fall of Satan. Many interpreters throughout history have promoted the idea that Ezekiel is comparing the king of Tyre to Satan. If we pursue this line of thought, we learn from Ezekiel that Satan began as a cherub appointed by God for the protection of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and his pride and jealousy of the human couple led him to betray his charge and bring harm on his wards instead. Michael Heiser, in his, what is his book called? the unseen realm, which is popular these days. Michael Heiser has explained, this is a quote from Heiser, although Ezekiel 28 is about the prince of Tyre, in describing this prince's downfall and original state, the prophet utilizes an older tale of a downfall in Eden. And then Heiser goes on to talk about, it must be talking about Satan. This interpretation goes all the way back to the late 2nd century AD, first attested in Tertullian. In his refutation of the doctrine of the early Christian heretic Marcion, Tertullian commented on Ezekiel 28. This is Tertullian. Also, if you turn up Ezekiel's prophecy, you will easily perceive that the angel was by creation good, and by his own act became corrupt. In the person of the prince of Tyre, this pronouncement is made against the devil. That's all Tertullian. And then Tertullian quotes Ezekiel 28, verses 11 to 16, and then he says, those words, it is evident, properly apply to the castigation not of that particular prince, the prince of Tyre, but of an angel. And then he continues talking about how interpreting Ezekiel 28 in terms of Satan. Once Tertullian established the idea that Satan is described in Ezekiel 28, many other Christians have followed suit. A younger contemporary of Tertullian, Origen of Alexandria in the early 3rd century, pointed out to his readers that the two prophecies against the prince of Tyre, that's Ezekiel 28, 1 through 10, and Ezekiel 28, 11 to 19, cannot be understood about a human being, or at least the second one cannot, the one under discussion here. Rather, the passage must refer to, Origen says, an adverse power. Origen's main goal in that discussion, as also for Tertullian, is to demonstrate that the evil angels were not created evil, but were created good and became evil by their own choice. This is what Origen and Tertullian thinks Ezekiel 28 demonstrates. Origen even has an explanation for why the adverse power was called Prince of Tyre in chapter 28, verse 2, in Ezekiel 28, verse 2. Because, according to Origen, he was originally appointed as the angel in charge of the city of Tyre. And we've seen this idea before, that there are angels that are in charge of various political entities, countries, nations, regions of the world, cities. So that's why, as Origen thinks, well, he's called the Prince of Tyre because Lucifer, Satan, whatever, was the angel in charge of Tyre. This is Origen. We think, therefore, that these words were spoken of a certain angel who had been appointed to the office of governing the Tyrian people, and to whose care their souls also seem to have been entrusted. This Satan interpretation of Ezekiel 28 became the standard Christian reading of this passage for many centuries and is still prominent today. It's not universal, though. For Ezekiel commentators affiliated with Churches of Christ, and that is a very select group, the verdict is split. Burton and Thelma Kaufman begin their comments on this passage with the pronouncement, "There is not a line of this that can be applied to any other being who ever lived except Satan!" Exclamation mark. On the other hand, in the Truth for Today commentary, Denny Petrillo argues forcefully that, quote, "the view that this passage teaches us more about the heart of Satan and the reasons for his fall should be rejected." He explains that Ezekiel 28, 11 to 19 contains, quote, "much exaggeration and irony." He says, "to take these images literally is to miss the function of the dirge." I myself am hesitant to see a description of Satan in Ezekiel 28, mostly because Ezekiel says he's talking about the king of Tyre. And I like to speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where the Bible is silent. The Bible is silent on Satan in Ezekiel 28, so I think it's best that biblical interpreters were also silent. Now, interpreters like Michael Heiser and Burton Kaufman would respond by saying that while Ezekiel does mention the king of Tyre and not Satan, Ezekiel is clearly comparing the king of Tyre to some other individual that can be described as a cherub in the Garden of Eden, who then fell because of pride, and this clearly refers to Satan. I would then respond by saying that the only reason this passage sounds to us like it's referring to Satan is because the passage has been interpreted as referring to Satan. In other words, it's circular reasoning. It sounds like it's Satan because it describes a being who's a guardian cherub in the Garden of Eden. Why do we think Satan was a guardian cherub in the Garden of Eden? Because Ezekiel 28 is talking about Satan. How do we know it's talking about Satan? Because it's talking about a guardian cherub in the Garden of Eden. It must be Satan. It's circular. I admit, of course, that the description of the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28, 11 and 19 cannot apply literally to the king of Tyre or any other human being. I think Petrillo has it right in suggesting that the passage does not apply literally to the king of Tyre, but rather metaphorically to him. It's figurative language. God is condemning the king for his arrogance, and he figuratively represents him as if he were a cherub in the Garden of Eden, perhaps the loftiest status imaginable. And then he fell from his exalted position and is now condemned, cast down before kings and turned to ash, perhaps the lowest position imaginable. He uses figurative language to describe the king of Tyre as going from the loftiest position imaginable to the lowest position imaginable. Now, there are all kinds of other issues we could talk about with regard to Ezekiel 28, translation issues that are actually fairly difficult to figure out. But let me just summarize. It is not obvious that Ezekiel was talking about Satan in Ezekiel 28, 11 and 19. This interpretation goes back to Tertullian in the late 2nd century AD, but it goes back no further that we know of. So we don't have any evidence that it goes back, pre-Christian times or anything like that. The traditional Jewish interpretation of the passage, again, going back to ancient times, so this is in rabbinic literature, etc., does not see Satan in Ezekiel, but rather, let's think about this. I'll tell you in just a second, but let me say it's describing someone in the Garden of Eden that fell because of pride. Now, if we're not going to say it's Satan, who else might that refer to? Adam. The traditional Jewish interpretation is that the king of Tyre is being compared to Adam. That's in rabbinic literature. So that's something we should think about. This has to do with the, that might be confusing to you if you're thinking, well, how could Adam be a cherub? Well, that's one of the translation issues. That maybe Ezekiel is actually not calling this being a cherub, but one of the options for translation is that he was with a cherub. So maybe it could be Adam. Anyway, that's an option. Maybe Ezekiel did not intend to invoke either Satan or Adam in his description of the king of Tyre, but was simply using figurative language about the arrogant monarch. If we decide not to interpret Ezekiel 28 in terms of Satan, then we would have no biblical support for the notion that Satan was once a beautiful cherub, and the evidence that he had been in the Garden of Eden would be diminished. All right, I'm going to leave Ezekiel 28 there and go to Isaiah 14. This is another passage that does not actually mention the name Satan or the devil, but has been instrumental in the development of the Satan legend. As in the case of Ezekiel 28, Isaiah 14 names the subject of the discourse as a pagan king. This time it's the king of Babylon. That's chapter 14, verse 4. As in the case of Ezekiel 28, the main topic is both the arrogance of this pagan king and God's condemnation of him. The essential string of verses comes in the middle of the oracle, and I'm going to read to you verses 12 through 14. And I forget what translation this is, but maybe it's the ESV. It's probably the New Revised. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly on the heights of Zaphon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. Does that sound like a passage that could be describing Satan? It especially sounds like it's describing the fall of Satan when we read the beginning of verse 12 in the KJV, which says, How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? Instead of day star, the KJV and the New King James give us Lucifer. Lucifer is a Latin word that means light bringer, and it is the word that appears in the Latin Vulgate in this passage. The Latin version of Isaiah 14:12 is the reason that people consider Lucifer to be one of the names of Satan. Of course, Lucifer, being a Latin word, could not have been a name in Hebrew or in Greek. Isaiah 14 is not the only time the word Lucifer appears in the Latin Bible. It also shows up in Job 11, verse 17, Job 38, verse 32, and 2 Peter 1, verse 19. In those two Job passages, Lucifer clearly does not refer to Satan, but rather to a star. This is the way the term Lucifer was used in Latin literature outside the Bible, especially in reference to the morning star or the planet Venus. The passage in 2 Peter, at 2 Peter 1:19, is actually talking about Jesus. He is the light bringer, or the day star, or the Lucifer that arises in your hearts. Just because the term Lucifer appears in the Latin Bible in Isaiah 14 does not mean that the passage refers to Satan or that Lucifer is used as a name. The idea that Isaiah is talking about Satan perhaps is not quite as popular as the idea that Ezekiel 28 refers to Satan. For instance, in regard to Isaiah 14, Burton and Thelma Kaufman declare Satan does not enter into this passage as a subject at all. Nevertheless, this interpretation is almost as ancient as the corresponding interpretation of Ezekiel 28. It seems that Origen is the first writer explicitly to interpret Isaiah 14 in terms of an evil angel. After his statements on Satan in Ezekiel 28, Origen continues, Again, this is a quote from Origen, again we are taught such things by the prophet Isaiah about another opposing power. Origen quotes Isaiah 14, verses 12 to 22, and then comments, Most clearly by these words is he who formerly was the day star and used to arise in the morning, shown to have fallen from heaven. A couple centuries later, Jerome's commentary on Isaiah is reluctant to claim that Isaiah 14 refers directly to Satan. Jerome first presents a historical interpretation of the passage where he interprets the oracle as concerning Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of Babylon, in conformity to the explicit wording of Isaiah. Then Jerome presents a spiritual interpretation of the passage in which he says that the text concerns the true Nebuchadnezzar, that is, the devil. Both Origen and Jerome seem to confirm the view of Everett Ferguson, who interpreted these early Christian uses of Isaiah 14 as meaning, quote, this is a quote from Ferguson, that what is said about these kings is an even truer description of the devil. So in other words, perhaps these early Christians, they recognized these passages weren't actually talking about the devil, but could be interpreted in that way. And that maybe later on became sort of a more hard and fast, Ezekiel is actually talking about the devil and Isaiah is actually talking about the devil. We need to wrap up. So there's more to say about Isaiah 14 as well. Some scholars are interested not in finding the devil there, but in finding maybe some other spiritual being lurking in the background of Isaiah's description. I think all of that is just complete silliness, to be honest. J.J.M. Roberts, in his commentary on Isaiah, I think has the right idea. In the absence of any compelling evidence, a textual evidence for such an explanatory narrative myth, it seems pointless to reconstruct it with the characters of this verse, Isaiah 14:12, and then use the phantom reconstruction to interpret the text we actually have. I think that's what people are doing with regard to whatever spiritual being they see lurking in the background, including Satan. Those scholars and various interpreters throughout history have tried to find a spiritual being in Isaiah 14:12, whether Satan or one going under another name. Readers who prefer evidence to fancy will apply the figurative language of the passage to the king of Babylon, in accordance with the explicit statement of the text. And if Isaiah 14 is not about Satan, we are left with no biblical description of the origins and nature of God's enemy. He is mentioned then only in the New Testament. Next week we will talk about Genesis 3 and think about some issues with regard to that, and then think through what does it mean that it's only a New Testament concept. Thank you.